What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over what interfaces are in Apex, when to use them, and how to use them. Alright guys, so today we are going to talk about what interfaces are in Apex. We're going to talk about when you should use them, what they are, and we are going to go over an implementation of how to actually use it, right? How do you actually use an interface? What does all that mean? Blah, 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 whatever. But real quick, before we get too deep into all of that stuff, I want to make you guys aware of a few things. Number one, if you didn't know, you can vote on next week's video. I give you that right to kind of decide which video you guys as a community would like to see next the most, right? So go over to the communities tab of this YouTube page, check it out, vote on next week's video so you get to see what you want to see. Second thing is, going forward, 2 random subscribers and 2 random people that share this content, that like this content enough to share it, will get certs on me. So if you want to take a Salesforce certification for free, I will fund it for you. 2 random people that subscribe to this channel or share the content and tag me in it on some social media channel, I'm giving you certs because you have donated so much money to me. I'm giving it back to you. The last thing is, if you want to see this channel continue to grow, get bigger, more people get free certs, more guest speakers, all that kind of stuff, consider getting the new channel membership. You get a couple cool things with it. You can get cool ridiculous emoticons that I've made. You can get extra voting privileges, and you can get a cool shirt depending on what tier you decide to subscribe to or become a member of. And again, all that money does go back to this channel and to this community and to the open source community so that, things just get better. This whole deal gets hopefully even more useful to all of you out there, because that's really my end goal, is to make something that's very useful for everyone. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's get back to the video. So, the first thing that we'll go over is just in general what an interface is. And you might get a little confused by this definition, and that's okay. Stick with me for the remainder of the video, and I promise by the end of it, it will make a lot of sense. Okay, but at a high level, what is an interface? Well, in front of me right now, or in front of you on the screen, we can see that we've got an interface built, right? It says public interface, task creator interface, instead of public class or something along those lines. And within this interface, we have a definition of a method, right? There's nothing in this method. There are no brackets, and I have a semicolon at the end of the method definition, which looks weird. But basically, what this is setting up for us is a contract, right? Because when you use an interface, you do what's over here, and I've got an actual class called the cases class, and it implements the task creator interface, right? You don't just to be very clear, I know that this is a confusing concept, especially if you don't have any standard object-oriented training or anything along those lines. But interfaces aren't meant to be like a regular class, right? You create them in the same kind of way that you would create a class, but that isn't really what they're intended to do. They're intended to bind another class to a contract that says, hey, cases class, if you implement the task creator interface, then you are required to create to make a method called create tasks that has these two parameters and returns this object type. Okay, and you can see down here at the bottom of this class, there is indeed a method called create tasks that has those two parameters and returns that object type. And if I decided all of a sudden to delete this method and save it, I'm going to get an error message when I try to deploy this that says the class cases must implement the method task creator interface create tasks. And the reason that it must implement that method is because I have basically bound this class, this cases class, to the contract of the task creator interface. And I am effectively saying, that contract effectively states you must have an implementation of this method, or your class will not compile and it won't work. Now, if I deleted this implements the task creator interface, then it compiled just fine, I think. Yep, okay. So it compiled fine, and we deployed that to the org. So, yeah, that at a high level is what an interface is. It is a contract that binds a class to implement particular methods. And I just want to state that this is not something that is Apex specific, by the way. Any object-oriented language that I'm aware of anyway has the ability to leverage interfaces. And now we're going to get into the why you would want to ever do this. Why would you want to create an interface? Why do you want a class to have a contract to say, I should always implement this method? And the reason why I won't lie to you, it's a little complicated to get your head around, especially if you haven't worked with really complex dynamic, things, or you haven't needed to build them. But if you're at all familiar with the solid principles, one of the last ones, actually the last one in the solid principles is the D. So there's SOLID, and the D stands for dependency inversion, which is one of the best reasons to use an interface. There are many others, but basically what it allows you to do, or what the concept of dependency inversion allows you to do, is make it so that a class is not really dependent on a specific implementation of another class. And again, this is complicated, but I promise when we get to the how to actually implement this, I'm going to go over all of these little things in way more detail, and you're going to, I hope, get it. If you've never read the book Clean Code or Clean Architecture by, Uncle Bob or Robert Martin, I would suggest it. It's going to kind of change the way that you think about how to build things, and for the better. But I'm kind of digressing here. Anyway, check out those books. I think I almost always link them in the description of my videos because I love them. But why would you use an interface? Let's get back on topic. It's basically because you don't want a service or business logic, among other things, potentially, in your org to be dependent on a specific implementation of some code. So a good example of this, and we will do an actual example in just a minute, but a good example of this is, what if you were, I don't know, say creating something that, I think one of the examples I've seen before is creating something that brews coffee, right? You have a service that brews coffee. This is a weird example. I'll go to a Salesforce example in a second. But you have a service that brews coffee. Would you want to have a specific implementation for one specific coffee maker? Or would you want it to be able to run for hundreds of different coffee makers, right? Ideally, you'd want your code to be usable regardless of the coffee machine. You could make 3,000 coffee machines and your code would still run the same way. And through the use of interfaces, the concept of abstraction, and through the principle of dependency inversion, you start to be able to achieve that. A good Salesforce example of this is one that I think at least a decent portion of people out there have maybe experienced, and that's creating a custom cloning button for records, right? The clone button itself is not going to have a ton of differences, typically, between each object type or potentially object record type combination that you put that clone button on. However, behind the scenes in the business logic that operates for, say, the contact or the account, you might have different implementations. You might, for an account, clone, specific account fields and also clone over related list items. But for a contact, you just clone the fields and you don't worry about any of the related records for that object. And the list there could go on and on. Maybe there's several record types for that object, and they all have different business logic based on the record type. Well, would you really want a controller that, or would you really want to have to create a clone button for every single one of those that calls out to a specific implementation of a class? No. I mean, ideally you would not, right? You would want one implementation of that clone button that could call out to what most people refer to as the service class or the business logic. By the way, if you don't know what a service class is or what any of that means, please check out the separation of concerns tutorial series where I go over that a lot more in depth, like a ton more. It is an important concept to understand and to try to implement in your orgs. Separation of concerns is critical, but especially when your org gets bigger and bigger in size as it grows. But let's get back to what we were talking about. So you've got a Lightning Web Component. That Lightning Web Component clones things. Ideally, you don't want to have to create something, like an Apex class that's a specific implementation for contacts, or one that's a specific implementation for accounts. You want a controller that's going to call out to a service and be able to, basically, that service will be able to change itself based on the object that it's being run on. So that's what we are going to build together today. We're going to create a simple clone tool, nothing super fancy, that's going to basically be able to change its implementation based on a couple of parameters and where it lives. So let's check it out, and hopefully everything starts to make a little more sense anyway afterwards. All right, so first things first, let's create our interface for this setup that we're going to do, for this cloning tool that we're going to build. So we will create a clone, I don't know, we'll just call it clone interface. By the way, actually most people don't do the underscore interface like I do. Oftentimes you will just see a capital I at the end, which is a denotation for interface. I'm a guy that likes to be very obvious with things, so I spell it out. Okay, so we'll just say clone interface, keep it simple. I'll zoom in here for you. And we'll create a couple of methods in here. I'll just keep them real simple for now. I might need to change them. We'll see. And we'll just say void clone record. And we will, oh, I've got to change this up here to an interface. And we'll create a clone record method, and we will create a void clone related records or something along that line. And it will have to take a ID, record ID. Okay. Ideally, this should really probably be bulkified, as in this should maybe take a set of IDs, but again, I'm trying to keep this simple. And it does depend on your scenario. So, all right. So we've got our interface. Very simple, as you can see. I'm just kind of saying, you know, whoever implements this interface, like we discussed earlier, has to implement this clone record method, and they have to implement this clone related records method. So let's now move on to our very simple Lightning Web Component. And in our Lightning Web Component, we'll just call this clone records. Oh, one of my dogs is really going at it up there. And we'll give it a description. This clones records for any object in the org. And we'll make it exposed. By the way, if you're using, I always say this, if you're using Visual Studio Code, you don't get this nice little interface here. Don't worry about it. It's this exposed thing. I'll go over how you can actually set it in a bit. And then we'll just hit OK. All right, so the clone records button, it extends Lightning element that is completely irrelevant. But let's go over here and just create a button. And that Lightning button will have a label of clone record, and we will do an on click that calls a method we haven't set up yet. So we will just quickly set up that method and say clone record. Cool. And we'll go back over here, and in the on click have it call the clone record method. All right, so we've got this very, very, very simple Lightning Web Component set up. Nothing fancy about it at the moment. If you were in Visual Studio Code, because we are going to be putting this, you know, exposing this to the outside world in Salesforce, or really just in Salesforce in general, then you'll want to add this tag is exposed is equal to true. And over here in the metadata, we're going to also want to add targets, and a target of, oh man, I'm just going to do Lightning 2 underscores record page. I'm just going to put this on the record page. You could also put this in a quick action or other places, but either way. So we've got our very simple button. Cool. Now we need to create a class that this button can call, an Apex class that the button can call to actually clone the record, right? So what we will do is the following. The other thing that we'll want to do actually before we set up that class is import the API here and do add API record ID. And if you're not familiar with what this does, number one, the API decorator that I'm importing here it's effectively a way to expose your methods or variables publicly. But in this instance, since we're going to put this on a record page, it retrieves the ID of the record on that page. So just by declaring this and placing this on a record page, I just inherently get access to the record ID. All right, cool. We've gone over that enough for now. I also do need a couple other variables just to keep this simple. I guess I could, actually I'll just figure this out in the code and make it even cooler and more dynamic, maybe. All right, so we will create a new Apex class, and we're going to call this clone records controller, because this is the controller for this Lightning Web Component. And we are also going to create another class called clone records service. And in this clone records service class, I'm going to give it a constructor. So it's going to be a public constructor and clone records service. If you don't know what a constructor is, by the way, you've never heard of it before, never used one, basically it's called when you construct your class or make a new instance of it in your code to set things up for you, to get your class ready for what's ultimately to come. But I'll put something in the description that goes over what constructors are if you don't know, which you should find out if you don't. Anyway, so we'll also create a variable that is of type clone interface. So we're going to create a private variable called of type clone interface called I don't know, clone logic or something. Sure, why not? And in here, for this constructor, we're going to pass in a clone interface, and we can call it clone class, and we'll say this dot clone logic equals clone class, and boom. So basically we're using what is referred to as dependency injection, which is a very fancy term for I'm going to pass in my the other classes that this clone record service class depends on to operate, right? So this class, clone record service, as we'll see here in just a second, is going to depend on the logic, or sorry, on this clone interface class, right? And so we want to, when this class is constructed, pass in the classes that it is dependent on and assign them in the constructor. Anyway, it's a simple idea. Can be confusing, but it's what we're doing here is called dependency injection. Is literally just passing into the constructor classes that your class here depends on to run. And since this is an interface, as we can see, we could pass in lots and lots of different classes, but we'll see that in just a second, and it's pretty cool. So down here, we will want this clone record service to have a clone method. So we'll just do public void clone record, and we will have this class simply call this dot clone logic dot clone record. I suppose you don't need this. This is totally up to you. I have gotten in the habit of doing this, but basically this just means this class's clone logic variable. This is simply referring to the class that you're in. It's very confusing. The first time I did that, it was very confusing, but that's all that this stands for. Okay, so we'll just keep it simple. Clone logic.clone record. Boom. Done. And I'm realizing that I really need to change this just a little bit. I need to, at the very least, pass in an ID. We'll just, again, keep this simple and pass in a record ID here, too, so that we can query for and clone the record. So where were we? Clone record service. Let's pass in a record ID. And yet another record ID will be passed into this clone interface. You might be able to see where we're going, but maybe not, and that's okay. Just stick with me. We will get to the super awesome part that will make all of these ideas come together and create a brain explosion or something like that. I don't know, that's a weird one. What did I call this? You don't have to name these methods the same, by the way. I just kind of like to, because as you can see, this class is not implementing the clone interface. It's rather calling a class, an abstract class that implements the clone interface to do the actual clone logic. All right, so we need a record ID passed in here as well, and we will call clone logic dot clone related records and pass in our record ID. Cool. And that's it. And this class will virtually never change, unless you have another scenario where you maybe need to clone parent records or something. I don't know. That kind of falls into clone related records, but I think you get where I'm going. So now that we have this clone record service set up and we have this clone record, these simple methods set up, we need to actually create the object specific classes that implement our clone interface that we've set up. So let's do that. Let's go into and create a new Apex class, and we'll call this account clone logic. I don't know. Could probably come up with a better name. But we will have this class finally implement the clone interface. And for us to be able to save this, we do need to implement the methods in here, the clone record and clone related records methods. So let's just grab these real quick, come back over to account clone logic, drop them in here, and actually turn them into methods. Like so. And now we have our account clone logic. And unfortunately, I'm sorry guys, I'm not actually going to build a full cloning tool for you. But what I'm going to do is just put some debug so we can see that this clone logic was actually called as opposed to another clone logic, which we're going to set up here in just a second. But we'll put a couple system debugs in here, and we'll just say this is the account clone logic running, and we'll put something down here that says this is the account clone related records logic running. So now let me save this, and hopefully everything saves. We'll see. It did. Wow, that's very surprising. I guess it's all pretty simple, but anyway, before I go too much further, let me just kind of, I guess, show you how cool this can really be. So the account clone logic class here, it is technically of type account clone logic and also of type clone interface. And that might mean nothing to you, but let me show you what it means to the code, and then maybe it'll mean something to you. So normally, what we would need to do to be able to run the account clone logic, account clone classes methods, rather, would be, to declare something like this and say new account clone logic. And then, you'd say account logic dot clone record and new ID. I don't have an ID. Account logic dot clone related records, blah, 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 right? But now there's a way for you to declare this in a different way. You could basically retype this if you wanted it to use the clone interface, and it would still work. So, I mean, just to run this to make sure it works, I can't construct an ID, which makes a lot of sense. But I also don't have an ID to pass. I guess I can grab one really quick just to make things run. I can just do a list, contacts equals select ID from contacts limit 1. And we'll just say contacts 0 dot ID. Now obviously I have contacts in my org. If you're following along with this, you might not. So, find a way to make an ID and then you can run it. Okay, so that ran, obviously, but that's not the point of this. The point is we could now type this class as clone interface. So what that means is I could come in here and say clone interface clone logic equals new equals clone interface account logic. So basically I'm retyping, or I'm casting, the account logic class to the clone interface class. And if I do that, this should still run. And it does. So you can see that I can now kind of dynamically change this. If I had another class called case clone logic, I could then type it as that implemented the clone interface. If the case clone logic class also implemented the clone interface, then I could pass in and retype it as a clone interface and run these methods, right? So we're maybe starting to see the bigger picture here, but let's put it all together. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll just create one more class, so many classes, and we'll call it contact clone logic. And yet again, we will have contact clone logic implement the clone interface. And that requires us to implement both of these methods. So I'm just going to copy them out of our other one, place it in here, and we will change our debugs to have this in them. Now, here's where it gets tricky and fun and interesting, maybe a little confusing. But just to restate what I've already stated here, if I went in and changed this again, right, this still runs, right? Oh, I haven't saved this yet. That's important, or else the code doesn't know that contact clone logic even exists when I run anonymous apex down here. So this does indeed compile still, even though I've changed this to clone logic and typed it as clone interface. Pretty cool. All right, so now's where it gets a little bit tricky. And we have to figure out a way from our clone records controller to pass to our clone records service the right type of clone interface class to run. And there's a lot of ways you could potentially do this. You could leverage the factory pattern, which if you don't know what the factory pattern is, let me tell you, it's an amazing thing. And I do have a video over it in the separation of concerns tutorial series. So if you want to know more about the factory pattern, definitely go check out that video. It's just a great thing that you should learn how to use because it will just open a world of development to you. But to keep this simple and interesting, let's figure out how to basically initialize a class type from just the name of the class, which ought to be pretty nifty. Anyway, wow, I'm using some real dad words today. I'm going to create an, well, let's just keep it simple. Actually, you know what? I'll go on ahead and do this. Of course, I can't remember how to create target configs, but we'll figure it out. So we'll call this class name. And then, so I'm back over here in the Lightning Web component, by the way. And I'm creating an API decorated class name variable. I will show you why here in just a sec. Because the next thing that we're going to do is go over to the metadata file and create some target configs. So, yeah, so we'll create some target configs. And in that target config XML, or target configs XML, we'll create a target config. And it will have the targets of lightning __ record page. And we need properties underneath this, I believe. Yep, and it needs the name of my variable and the type of my variable. So the type is string, and this was a class name, I think, but let's just check that. Yep. And that'll do it. So basically what this will allow me to do is when I put this on a Lightning record page, I can now just fill out the name of my class, which we'll see here in just a sec. All right, so we've got a record ID, class name, clone record, and we've got this clone records controller, which we have nothing in yet. So let's actually set up our clone records controller now that all the other auxiliary stuff is good to go. And we will just call the, we'll just have a clone records method in here. So we'll create an OR enabled public static void clone records, and we'll pass it in the ID, record ID, even though I'm not really using it. And we will call the clone records service, which we will do by saying clone records service clone records equals new clone records service. And we need to pass in here our, we also need to pass in the class name. That will be very important. We'll need to pass in our clone interface to this clone record service class, right? But how do we do that? We don't know where we've placed this component, right? Like, we could have placed this component a bajillion different places. How do we know which class to actually initialize? That's where the beauty of this wonderful class name thing is going to come in, because it's pretty cool. So what we're going to actually do is initialize a type. And so what we will do here is say type clone interface is equal to type dot forName class name. And so this is a little weird, but basically what this is allowing you to do, this type class that Salesforce makes available to you, is it's saying, let's create a class type of this class name. So you can pass a string into it of any class name in your org that exists, and it's going to create that type for you. Obviously, it's very generalized here, but in abstract, but that basically makes your class type, which is kind of cool. And then what we can do is say clone interface, clone interface instance equals clone interface dot new instance. I probably should have named this something else, so let's just refactor this to be a little more clear. We'll call it clone interface type. So what we're now doing is taking this class name, creating a new type of it, and casting it into the clone interface, right? Kind of like we did right down here. Literally the same idea, just abstract, right? Instead of hard typing contact clone logic, account logic equals new contact clone logic, we're just saying type, class type, clone interface type is, equal to the type of this class name, which might be contact clone logic, it might be account clone logic, it might be 100 other things. And now we have our instance of clone interface instance, and we can drop that in there, and this will run so beautifully. And we can just, to be consistent, do a clone related records method. Oh, I actually need to call the clone records dot clone records method and pass it the record ID. And same deal down here. We will call clone records dot clone related records and pass it the record ID. And now you can kind of see, right, like this class is really never going to have to change. Like this implementation of this method is really never going to have to change. It's dynamic. It doesn't depend on the contact clone logic class or the account clone logic class. It depends on that interface, which is kind of like an abstract tie to those service classes, which is really cool because now you can just drag and drop whatever you think you might want now or in the future, and it'll run. But we haven't seen it run yet, so let's see it run. Let's first import these methods. We'll import clone records controller from clone records controller, and we'll also import clone related records controller. By the way, I maybe can't spell. These right here, these can be named whatever you want. These variables do not matter. Name them whatever you want. They're just variables effectively. So down here in clone record, what we'll end up doing is calling that controller method, clone records controller, and we need to pass it in the record ID And we need to pass it in the class name. And then just, you know, give it a empty return method and just say something like, oops, console.log success or something. Okay. And we'll just do one more method for the clone related contacts, and we'll put another button on there, and we'll watch it run. Related records. And I will just do the same thing here because it takes the same parameters, and I will just call it from here, clone related records. Cool. All right, so we've got this set up. We've got our little button. We've got all of our interesting things set up in the background here. Let's see the magic happen. All right, so let's log into Salesforce. First things first. Doing that over here. And I'll bring it over here. If it ever loads, we'll see. And we will just go to random Lightning record page and drop this bad boy on there. Lightning app builder. What's first? Account page. Let's edit the account page. And we will drop this on here and see if we can get it to do what we think we want it to do. So we've got our abstract clone records component, and we'll just put it up here. Oh boy, it looks pretty ugly. We'll put it there. It's at least a little better. And we need to pass it a class name. Now you probably would ideally want to name this property a little better than I have, so it's clear what you actually want to put here, but it's not really the point of this. Our class name for this will be, for the time being, account clone logic. So we'll just drop that in here and save it. And now we will just go to an account record and see if this thing actually runs and I didn't screw anything up. You never know. All right, so we'll go over here, go to good old tilapia fish, and I'm gonna open up the maybe something's really thinking there. Oh, admin notice. We'll open up the dev console just so that we can, check out the logs, and we'll click clone records and see what happens. And it was indeed successful, thankfully, and I didn't screw anything up, hopefully. And we can see that this is the account clone logic running. So cool. And this is the account clone related records logic running. Now we went back and we edited this page and we changed it so that the class name was instead contact clone logic. We should, if we go back to that page and click the clone button again, see that come through. But let's just put it up here, maybe. It's hard to get two screens on at one time on this setup. And then hit clone records again. It came up with 2 successes, so let's check them out. And we've got, this is the contact clone logic running. And for the second one, we should hopefully have, this is the contact clone related records logic running, which is unbelievably cool, in my opinion. And on top of being unbelievably cool, super useful, right? Because now this controller does not need to care whether it is on an account record or a contact record or a who knows what other object you might be making record. It doesn't matter. it will work anywhere, always, forever. You know, as long as you keep the account clone logic or contact clone logic classes that you put in there for the class name, right, that we just took a look at anyway. Unbelievably useful. And now, you know, if, you know, at some point in the future we need to change this, it's so much easier, right? We don't have 15 different clone record, you know, clone records buttons out there in the world. We have one, and we only need to fix the logic for that one button. And more than that, if you didn't use these interfaces and break out this logic like this, well, the only other way that you could maybe do this is by using a bunch of if statements or switch statements or whatever else, blah, blah, blah. And it would get so challenging to go back and update all of that if statement logic and not accidentally break things. Your classes would be huge. Now I know, you know, if I want to change the clone logic for an account, boom, I just go to this one class, I change it. I don't have to worry about it accidentally maybe breaking the clone logic for the contact records. It's completely separate. So you get all of this incredible power and separation, and you know, you take away all of these ugly dependencies that make code huge and difficult to work with, and now you just have this, you know, beautiful reusable thing that you can kind of take anywhere with you, and it's easy to update the logic in the future. So it's just a great thing, knowing how to use interfaces and how to leverage it. It brings the amount of code down in your org so much. It makes the code in your org so much easier to work with, and it breaks the dependencies between service logic, or, you know, service level classes that hold your true ultra high level business logic from the what are referred to as details, or the you know, the UI that's actually running, right? The dependencies don't exist anymore, which is just a beautiful thing. But anyway, I hope this has kind of shown you the power of interfaces and what you can truly do with them if you think about it and you start thinking of things in a little bit different way. If you want a lot more information about interfaces and object-oriented programming, how to write clean code, design clean architecture, all that kind of stuff, there's several books that I recommend that are in the description. They're wonderful, so go check them out. That's it for today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope it has helped you see the usefulness of interfaces, understand what they are, all that kind of stuff. So last thing, just like always, make sure to like, and subscribe and hit the bell, all that kind of stuff if you enjoy these videos. And also go vote on next week's video, because why not, right? You'd rather see what you want to see as opposed to what somebody else wants to see. So go vote so you're not sad. It may not work out, but you'd rather have a voice than not have one, at least I think. Anyway, I'll see you guys next week for yet another video. All right, bye-bye.